Deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, there is a group of people who have lived in the shadows of history for over 200 years. They were known as the Melungeons, a mysterious community with dark skin, fine straight hair, and startling blue or hazel eyes. For generations, they were a riddle that neither historians nor neighbors could solve. Local legends claimed they were the descendants of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors, lost tribes of Israel, or even the survivors of the abandoned Roanoke colony. They were often marginalized, living on the high ridges of Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky, fiercely protective of their heritage but unsure of their own origins. But now, the era of guesswork is over. Modern geneticists have finally cracked the Melungeon mystery using cutting-edge DNA sequencing, and the results are absolutely nothing like what the experts or the legends predicted. We are looking at a genetic blueprint that redraws the map of early American history and reveals a story of survival, forbidden love, and a defiant group of people who managed to create a unique identity right under the nose of a changing nation. Today we are uncovering the truth of the Melungeon DNA results and why they are causing us to rethink everything we know about the American frontier. To understand the weight of this DNA reveal, you first have to understand the mystery. Imagine living in a time and place where your rights, your property, and your safety depended entirely on your racial classification. In the 1700s and 1800s, the Melungeons were a walking contradiction. They didn't fit into the neat little boxes of white, black, or Native American. Because of their unique appearance, they were often treated with suspicion. Some census takers called them free persons of color, while others simply labeled them as other. This ambiguity led to a massive collection of origin myths. If you asked a Melungeon in 1890 where they came from, they might tell you they were Portuguese. This wasn't just a random guess. It was a strategic claim used to maintain their freedom in a society that was increasingly hostile to anyone who wasn't clearly of European descent. The first major breakthrough in the Melungeon DNA project didn't come from a dusty library, but from a swish of a cheek swab. A massive group of researchers collected samples from hundreds of people who could prove their descent from the core Melungeon families. Names like Mullins, Collins, Gibson, and Goins. They weren't just looking at the surface-level ancestry percentages you get from a commercial kit. They were looking at the deep ancestry markers discovered in the Y-DNA, which traces the father's line, and the mitochondrial DNA, which traces the mother's line. When the data started pouring in, the scientists were stunned. The results didn't show a group of Portuguese sailors or a lost tribe from the Mediterranean. Instead, the Y-DNA, the paternal line, revealed a powerhouse of sub-Saharan African heritage. In over 80% of the core Melungeon families tested, the male ancestor was of African origin. But here's where it gets interesting. The mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, was almost exclusively Northern and Western European. This means the original Melungeon families were formed by the union of African men and European women in the very earliest days of the American colonies, likely in the mid-17th century. This was a time before the strict racial laws of the South had fully hardened, a window in history where people of different backgrounds lived, worked, and fell in love on the edges of the settled world. But that's just the beginning of the mystery. If the Melungeons were simply a mix of African and European heritage, they wouldn't have been such a riddle. The DNA also revealed a third, much smaller but very significant component, Native American. However, it wasn't the large percentage that many Melungeons had grown up believing. For years, the story was that they were primarily Cherokee or Saponi. While the Native American DNA is definitely there, it exists in much smaller fragments than the legends suggested. The geneticists realized that the Melungeons weren't just a tri-racial isolate group. They were a group that had purposefully moved to the mountains to protect a specific way of life. The DNA results tell a story of a founding population. This occurs when a small group of people moves to an isolated area and marries primarily within their own group for generations. This essentially locks in the genetic signature of the original founders. In the case of the Melungeons, they moved to the high ridges of the Appalachians to escape more populated areas where they might face trouble because of their mixed heritage. On those ridges, they created a culture of self-sufficiency. Because they were so isolated, their unique look, that mix of African, European, and Native traits, became the standard for the community. It wasn't a mystery to them, it was just family. But to the outsiders looking in from the valleys, they were an enigma. One of the most fascinating aspects of the DNA reveal is what it says about the Portuguese claim. For a long time, historians thought this was a total fabrication. But when geneticists looked closer at the African markers in the Melungeon Y-DNA, they found something curious. The specific African lineages present in the Melungeon families are often found in areas that were heavily influenced by Portuguese trade and colonization in the 1600s, such as Angola and the Congo. It is highly likely that the original African ancestors of the Melungeons had spent time in Portuguese-controlled regions, or on Portuguese ships before arriving in Virginia. The claim of being Portuguese wasn't a lie. It was a distant, whispered memory of where their journey across the Atlantic had originated. This discovery has completely flipped the script on Appalachian history. We often think of the mountains as a place originally settled by Scots-Irish pioneers. But the DNA proves that the Melungeons were there just as early, if not earlier. They were the original frontiersmen, pushing into the wilderness to find a place where they could be free. The genetic results show that they weren't drifters or refugees. They were a stable, land-owning community that was trying to protect its future. The DNA reveals that the Melungeon families were incredibly consistent in their marriage patterns, showing a high level of community cohesion that lasted for 200 years. But what about the blue eyes and the fine hair? This is where the complexity of genetics really shines. When you have a group with a rich mix of backgrounds, the way those genes express themselves can be unpredictable. You can have a person with a significant amount of African ancestry who has light-colored eyes if both parents carry the recessive trait. In the isolated Melungeon communities, these recessive traits from their European mothers were often brought to the forefront. This created the striking physical appearance that made them famous, a look that felt otherworldly to the people of the 19th century. The reaction to these DNA results has been a mix of shock, relief, and in some cases, a bit of resistance. For many people who grew up with the legend of the lost colony or shipwrecked sailors, the reality of a more homegrown origin was hard to swallow at first. But for most, the DNA results have been a source of immense pride. They show that the Melungeons weren't a mystery to be solved by outsiders. They were a testament to the complex, diverse reality of early America. They represent the undocumented history of the country, the stories that were never written down in textbooks, but were written in the double helix of their descendants' cells. The geneticists also discovered something they didn't expect: a high frequency of certain rare genetic conditions within the Melungeon population. One of these is a specific type of Mediterranean fever. This initially added fuel to the fire of the Mediterranean origin theories. However, after more deep sequencing, they realized that these conditions were actually the result of the founder effect I mentioned earlier. When a small group is isolated, rare genetic mutations can become more common simply because the gene pool is so small. It wasn't proof of where they came from, but rather proof of how long they had stayed together in those mountain ridges. As the study continued, the researchers began to map the migration of the Melungeons across the South. By tracking the specific DNA signatures of families like the Goings and the Gibsons, they could see the families moving from the Virginia Tidewater into North Carolina, and finally into the mountains of East Tennessee. This migration perfectly matches the timeline of when racial laws were becoming more restrictive in the coastal colonies. The DNA effectively acts as a GPS, showing a group of people moving further and further into the wilderness in search of a place where their mixed status wouldn't be an obstacle to owning land or having a family. The story of the Melungeons is also a story of passing. As the decades went by and the community became even more blended, some members of the community were able to pass into the white population, while others were pushed into the black population. The DNA results show this clearly, with some descendants of the original Melungeon families now identifying as white, while others identify as black or multiracial. The genes are the same, but the social experience changed depending on which branch of the family tree a person fell on. This makes the Melungeons a perfect case study for how race is often a social construct built on a much more fluid genetic reality. One of the most emotional parts of this journey has been for the families who finally have an answer. For generations, they had to listen to neighbors call them names like the people of the ridge or the dark ones. They were excluded from schools and social circles based on a mystery that no one could define. Knowing that their ancestry is a rich, complex blend of 3 continents, Africa, Europe, and America, gives a sense of closure. The DNA doesn't just provide a list of percentages. It provides a sense of belonging to a specific, resilient lineage that survived against all odds. The researchers emphasize that the Melungeon signature isn't a single gene. There is no Melungeon DNA that you can find in a lab. Instead, it is the specific combination and the history of how those genes were passed down. It is a story of recombination. Every time a new generation was born on Newman's Ridge, the deck was shuffled again. But because the group was so tight-knit, the cards remained within the same deck for 2 centuries. This is what made the Melungeons genetically unique. Not that they had secret DNA, but that they had a secret history of staying together. The Melungeon mystery also highlights the power of modern technology to give a voice to the voiceless. The people who formed these families 300 years ago were often illiterate and had no way to leave a written record for their children. They were the unnoted people of the frontier. But they left a record in their children and their children's children. Every cheek swab processed in a lab today is like reading a lost diary from 1650. We are finally learning the names and the origins of the people who were erased from the traditional historical narrative. What about the Native American connection? While the percentages were lower than expected, the DNA did confirm that Melungeon families were indeed integrating with the indigenous peoples of the Southeast. This happened primarily when the families were moving through the frontier zones of North Carolina and Tennessee. It wasn't a one-off event, but a gradual process of cultural and biological exchange. The Melungeons weren't the same as the Cherokee, but they were certainly relatives, linked by shared experiences on the frontier and a shared desire for independence. The geneticists are now looking at even more specific data, trying to find the exact villages in West Africa and the exact regions in Europe where the founders originated. They are finding matches in the Viking regions of the British Isles and the Bantu populations of Central Africa. This is a level of detail that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. It shows that the Melungeons were actually more global than the people who were judging them. They carried the history of the entire Atlantic world in their veins. As the word gets out about the DNA results, interest in Melungeon heritage has exploded. People across the country are checking their family trees for those telltale names and stories of ancestors from the ridges. The DNA has turned what was once a source of shame or confusion into a badge of honor. To be Melungeon is to be a part of the original American melting pot, a group that was multicultural long before the word was even invented. But we must also respect the privacy and the complexity of this heritage. The DNA reveals a lot, but it doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't tell us what it felt like to stand on Newman's Ridge and watch the sun set over a valley where you weren't welcome. It doesn't tell us about the songs they sang or the stories they told their children to keep their spirits up. Politics and social pressures forced the Melungeons to hide their history. Now, science is helping them reclaim it. But the cultural heart of the Melungeon people, their resilience, their hospitality, and their love of the mountains, is something that goes beyond what a lab can measure. The mystery of the Melungeons is a reminder that we are all walking mysteries. We all carry the stories of thousands of ancestors, many of whom were lost to history. Melungeons just happen to have a history that was more visible on their skin and in their eyes. By cracking the code, geneticists haven't ended the mystery. They've just opened a new chapter. They've given us a more grounded, more human story to replace the myths of Portuguese kings and lost colonies. It is a story of ordinary people who did something extraordinary. They survived. As we look at the DNA results, we see a bridge between the origins of the American colonies and the diverse world we live in today. The Melungeons were the first to cross that bridge, and they did it with a broadaxe in one hand and a family pride that wouldn't quit. While the truth might be different from the legend, the reality is much more powerful. The Melungeons weren't lost sailors or biblical wanderers. They were the architects of a new kind of humanity, one that didn't care about the lines between black, white, and red. So, if you ever find yourself driving through the misty gaps of the Appalachians and you see a house tucked away on a high, lonely ridge, think about the Melungeons. Think about the African fathers and the European mothers who looked out at that same view 300 years ago and decided to start a world of their own. Their DNA is a testament to the fact that love and family have always been more powerful than the laws of men. The results are in, the mystery is solved, and the answer is beautiful. The Melungeons weren't from somewhere else. They were the very first Americans in every sense of the word. They are the descendants of the brave and the bold, and their bloodline is a shimmering map of our shared history. The Portuguese myth may have been a shield, but the genetic reality is a crown. They are the survivors of the ridges, and their story is finally being told, one base pair at a time. The Melungeon mystery is a closed case for the scientists, but for the families, it is a brand new beginning. A chance to stand tall, look back at their ancestors, and know exactly who they are and where they came from. It's a story of a hidden legacy, finally brought into the light, and it's a story that belongs to all of us.